Hello, hello. Hi, everyone.
Hello, Vanessa.
How's it going? We've got a lot of people jumping on right now, so um, I'm gonna mute you all and allow you to unmute yourselves. Okay, so just as a default, I'll just mute everybody, but you can go ahead and unmute if you want to say hi. And at the end, we'll take some questions, so certainly unmute yourself for that. But it's really nice to see all of your lovely faces. I can't see all of the faces because I can only see, I think, 20 at a time, but we've got a lot of folks jumping on. I'll give everybody just a couple minutes because it is 6 o'clock right on the dot. We are already recording, so this recording will be available on our website. If you don't want your name or face to show up on the recording, don't worry. The Zoom recording basically just shows me and the comments and screenshots that I'm going to show. So your stuff doesn't, your name and image won't show up on there. My dogs barking are going to show up on there because you can hear that. As many of you know, I have 4 dogs. We're all working from home. We're all at home, especially since it's the evening. And every once in a while, we may have some dog-related interruptions. So hi, everyone. I found out about this feature. I don't know that any of you will be chatting to each other privately. You certainly feel free if you know other folks on the call, or you want to make friends with other people on the call who start chatting. Just know that I can see your comments later because everything gets transcribed and sent to me. So just don't talk trash. I don't think this is a group that is likely to talk trash about me because you are volunteering to spend an hour of your evening listening to what I have to say. But nonetheless, I thought I'd just give you that little warning. Good, I'm glad you all like dogs. I figured out how to send reminder emails, kind of, so you likely got one from me about half an hour ago, but it was just a resending of the confirmation email. All right. Okay, so we've got lots of folks on, and I'm going to get started because this is such a big topic to talk about. And I just had the sense, when I was figuring out, everyone wants, when they're big world events, certain people who are extroverted and in certain roles where we feel like our voices are important, feel the obligation to say something about said world events. Now, I know not everybody feels that way. Not everybody feels obligated to say stuff, but I did. And when I was thinking about what to say, I had to start from one of my mantras, which is help from where you are, because that's really all any of us can do is help from where you are. You may not be able to make the most difference. You might not be in the position to help on this particular subject, a particular problem that our country is facing at the moment, but from wherever you are, you can make a difference. So I decided to put some initial thoughts about news polarization around the topics of riots and
Yeah.
protests. Hold on, somebody's unmuted.
Yes.
I'm gonna mute you there. But what I really wanted to do was get people together to talk about stuff, because these webinars have been well attended in the past, and um, I feel like a lot of folks were in a place where they just wanted to process the news a bit. Just that very exercise of processing what is happening in our news environment, I thought would be helpful and clarifying, and is a thing that we specialize in. So that's why the topic of our webinar today is news polarization. We're looking at the problems related to racism, police brutality, protests, riots, looting, violence, and change through the lens of news polarization. So we're going to look at it kind of narrowly. We're going to look at it through articles across the media landscape, because that's what we do every single week, and use it to frame our discussion around that. We're not going to touch on everything. Everything there is to be said about this topic. No one person is in the position to do that. But what we can do is help from where we are. All right. Let me just go over a brief little agenda. The purpose of this call is really to, hold on, I'm gonna adjust my little speaker, my little windows here. Okay. The purpose of this call is really to examine the contemporary way that news and news-like sources, and in turn social media, polarize people around really difficult topics. And we'll examine this phenomenon and how to combat it in our, not only in our interactions online, but we'll talk about how to teach about polarization in a classroom setting. As you may have experienced, the topics related to the current news cycle are among the hardest to discuss online and in classrooms. So we're gonna talk about those things that I mentioned: racism, police brutality, riots, protests, and how to affect change. And my hope is that you see how close analysis of news articles is actually one of the best ways to have effective conversations about such difficult topics. And before I jump into everything, I just want to say that we do a lot of webinars and about news content for free, and we make these recordings available for free on our site. And in exchange, all I ask of you is to listen to the briefest of pitches here at the beginning. And as you know, a lot of you have been longtime supporters of what we do here at Adfantes. And what we do is we rate the news and we teach others to rate the news. In order to sustain our work, we rely on memberships and sales of our other products and services. Our memberships include like monthly or annual billing for $5 a month, $10 a month. You get unlimited downloads to the media bias chart. You get to vote on our next sources, and we're always seeking to come out with new ways and add value to our members. And we've got some exciting stuff coming out in the next few months about that. We've got some merchandise, shirts and mugs and things of that nature. And then we also have an educational software platform called CART, a content analysis rating tool. And you're actually going to see that in action here, because we're going to use it to go through some articles like we would do in classes. So like I said, briefest of pitches, and it's over. All right. So our agenda here is to first frame the discussion of polarization, and then go through the example news articles. Some of those I posted on my initial Facebook post, and showed some screenshots of that in the email. We're going to go through some of those actual articles and talk about what they're doing in those articles. And then at the end of this, hopefully you'll come to like a nuanced understanding of the role of protests and riots, because we're going to focus on that topic specifically. And then we'll cap it off with some action items, like what you can do to combat polarization in the news in the future. And we'll leave some time for Q&A. All right, sound good? Feel free to give a thumbs up, or there's like a yes or no button, or comments, whatever. I'm probably not going to pay too much attention to the chat section, because I want to leave some time for questions at the end. But if for some reason you can't see my screen, or there's some technical difficulties where you can't hear me, you wave at me, flag me down. Okay. All right, because I can see your faces. Okay. So let's frame the discussion about polarization. What we're combating is not the other side of a particular argument, because there are legitimate liberal and conservative positions on any number of issues. What we're combating is extreme polarization, the phenomenon of becoming so entrenched in the belief that everything should be distilled into an us versus them argument, that you literally can't see or understand the arguments of those who you consider your political opponents. When you get into that state, or when your students or your friends or family get into that state, I'm sure you've experienced that it's very hard to have any kind of meaningful progress. So what we want to do is get away from really simple, binary, us versus them types of characterizations of any issue, and especially complex issues. Like, we're dealing with complex issues right now. So the nature of hard problems that persist for a long time in society they tend to persist because they are complex. You know, you can say something like, you know, racism isn't complex. It's just bad to be racist. Sure, but there's a long history. Like racism has existed for a long time due to many different causes, and has been implemented in different like historical steps. And as it stands right now, it's not just like the solution isn't just stop being racist. It's a complex set of problems to unwind. To take a slightly less polarizing example, I guess, but not really, healthcare. Healthcare policy is like that too. You know, we have these huge entrenched problems that are very apparent to all of us about our healthcare system. Too expensive, people aren't covered, we don't have good health outcomes in the United States, all these things. So, but the answer to these, to solving this is not simple. It's a complex set of, you know, policy changes and adjustments that we'd have to make over time to unwind this, because there are many root causes. When we're dealing with complex, like things that require a complex solution, one of the most unhelpful things is to try to just divide it into a very simple binary of us versus them. So good reporting, news reporting on complex topics requires articles to be complete, to be detailed, to be nuanced, to provide lots of context, and polarizing articles themselves tend to be very narrowly focused on a divisive thing. And there are a lot of potential us versus them and left versus right topics that aren't necessarily as simple as left and right and us versus them. For example, pro-protest and riot versus anti-protest and riot. That's the thing we're going to focus on the most during this call and in our articles. But that's not a simple binary. If you go on social media and look at memes, though, you might be fooled into thinking that it is a binary thing, but it's not. Okay. Pro-police versus anti-police is another one of those things. Not that it's not as simple as pro-police or anti-police. There are other dividing lines as well, like pro-media, anti-media, or more specifically pro-journalist, anti-journalist, or whose fault things are. You know, is it Democrats' fault? Is it Republicans' fault? Can we blame this all on Trump? Can we blame this on Obama? Can we blame this on Biden? Can we point out the things that Democratic mayors and governors are doing that are wrong, and things that Republican mayors and governors are doing right? Things like that. Another thing we can hold on just a second. Who the looters and the destroyers are, like who the outside agitators are. On the right, yeah, there's lots of headlines and memes about how it's Antifa, which is a far left loose organization. They're called Antifa, short for anti-fascist, you know, basically very left-wing extremists. And on the left, you'll see reporting that it's actually white supremacists that are outside agitators that are the looters and the destroyers. So there's all these dividing lines on which polarizing media can easily create divisions. So like I said, we're going to narrowly focus on the pro and anti protest / riot framing, but take a step back and understand why it's really easy to polarize people. So part of it is our fault, right? Our own human nature that makes us subject and susceptible to polarization. One is that we crave simplicity and simple answers in a complex world. And as I mentioned before, these are complex problems. So if you are tired of dealing with complexity, you just want some certainty, that's like a normal human reaction, and that's a normal human coping mechanism to want to simplify things and say there is a right and a wrong side, there's a simple solution to this, and if we just all realize that we could, and you allowed my side to win, we could just move on, right? Another thing is that people would rather share share memes and share simple things to express their worldview and express what side they're on, rather than come up with their own content and write something thoughtful that has a nuanced point of view. That's kind of the nature of memes, is that they're really easily shareable. And if people don't feel like they have the right words to say in a situation, but they feel like one side expresses their general feeling better than the other side, it's really easy to just post a meme reflecting that. Okay. The other thing is that people crave being right. It's just a very satisfying, visceral feeling. It's just part of human nature to want to be right. So when you read things that reinforce your existing worldview, it's just gratifying to continue to do so. Okay, so it's easy to polarize us, not just because it's our fault, but because people who know this about human nature take advantage of it, right? So polarizers take advantage of this, sometimes for money, but sometimes for power. So for money, folks that run TV networks or websites, it's easy to draw in eyeballs by playing on, simple solutions, making people feel like they're right, giving them memes to post. So it's really easy to draw readership and viewership and take advantage of that. And sometimes folks do it for power. So politicians in particular, like if you want a groundswell of support that's just associated with a side, and you want to appeal to a broad set of people, you try to simplify and dumb down the message so that it reaches people who are maybe don't pay that close of attention to the topics. Maybe they don't have a nuanced understanding of the history of civil disobedience and protests in this country and how that's affected change, or they don't have a historical understanding of how the structures that continue to implement racism in our society to this day, right? So the more the simpler you can make it, the more power you can grab by just polarizing folks and having them sort into one side or the other. Okay, and that's kind of the nature of politics right now. All right, let's go through some actual news articles. Yay, it's my favorite thing to do. But actually, before that, let me warn you, okay? Like I warn anybody who wants to be an analyst, it is sometimes upsetting to read articles from the other side, especially if you're not accustomed to it. Sometimes the nature of social media is that we are in our echo chambers or filter bubbles, whatever you want to call it. So you rarely see like the grossest content from the other side. You tend to see the stuff that reinforces you. That's just the nature of things. And even if you try to go and seek out other points of view, like if you are left-leaning and you tend to go over to Fox News just every once in a while just to see what they're saying, just for a moment, good for you, but you're still not seeing like the full spectrum of like all right-wing media, right? If you're on the right, if you watch Fox News primarily and you just jump over to CNN and say, now I understand what the left is saying, you don't see all the conversations that are happening on the left. So what we're going to do is go through articles, some on the right, some on the left, and some of them are fairly extreme and may contain points of view that are offensive to you at first. Okay, so this is part of the design of our CART News Literacy program, is to get folks to read what is going on the other side of the news media, the side that they're not familiar with. Okay, and how to deal with that, I recommend think about it as like, if you read one that turned your stomach and you just like really find it offensive, think of it as like inoculation against future offensive content that you see. I will indicate on the where on the chart these sources lie. I got a question about that. So yes, I will. We're actually going to go rate them and put them on the chart ourselves, okay, during this conversation. And so view it as inoculation. Once you see something like truly offensive and like gross for the first time, like, gosh, I can't believe people on the other side say that, the next time you won't be surprised. So the next time, like if your relative brings this up or like posts it at you, you can you'll have the advantage of not being shocked, and you'll be able to respond. Yeah, because you have thought about it previously about you know, what your points are against that. The other thing is, think of it as intel about what the other side thinks. Because if you, at the end of the day, after reading the universe of facts, opinions, and analysis, we're not doing this just to say, well, all opinions are valid and all opinions are equally right. We're not doing that. Your job as a reader of the news, as a consumer of the news, is to take into consideration all the facts, all the analysis, and all the opinion that exists about a topic in the world, and then make a call on what's right. Make a call on what to do, okay? And how are you going to do that? Well, you're going to use your own moral judgment. You're going to use the universe of facts that's available to you, and you're going to use your reasoning to make a decision on what you believe. Okay, think of your role as a judge in this case. The judge has to be fair, but the judge at the end of the case is, and they're required to listen to both sides and be as impartial as possible. But at the end of the day, one side is going to have better facts than the other, and you can make a call. So you know, a common criticism of the media bias chart and any kind of media analysis from the left is that reading and surfacing right-wing media is something called both sidesism. Like you're just saying, oh, both sides do it, so therefore both sides are right. It's not what I'm saying at all, okay? Just because I'm pointing out that there are two sides to a particular issue, it's like being in court. Like there's always two parties in a court case, not because they're both equally right. One side has better facts than the other, and that side will ultimately win, right? When you look back at history, there's been two sides of lots of things, and with the benefit of hindsight, when we're not like in the moment, we can see like which side was right. So when you look back at the civil rights protests in the 1960s, we've kind of moved on and decided as a society that, yeah, segregation was super wrong. That was bad, right? No one really argues that. Like most, you know, most folks, most reasonable-minded folks in America today will point back and say, Martin Luther King Jr. was good. Segregation was bad. And everybody could obviously clearly see that the whole time. But if you just take yourself back and imagine being in the mid 1960s, you know, it wasn't so clear. There were two sides. So imagine that you want to make the right decision on what you should do as a citizen, like how you should vote, where your activism should be engaged, how you should view certain policies. Look at how you think this moment is going to be viewed 40 years from now, and decide, like, you know, were you on the right side? Did you make the right call based on the information that you have available to yourself today? Because, you know, 40 years from now, maybe 10 years from now, people are going to look back at this period and be like, oh yeah, that side was definitely wrong. I mean, keep in mind, we're kind of always in the midst of a decision or a time like that. You know, during World War II, right up until the Nazis lost, the Nazis were like, we're right and we're gonna win, right? And then like the second it was over, people act like Nazis just disappeared. Like it just wasn't a thing anymore, and everybody was like, oh yeah, clearly the Nazis were wrong. No, there were people fighting for it like right up to the very, very end, okay? So there can be a wrong side, there can be a worse position, and we use the facts to judge, and you get to be the judge. All right, let's again get into sorry, I said we were going to get into the articles and I lied. Now we're going to get into the articles. Let me share my screen. Share my screen. Okie dokie. Okay. You should see something that says CART. It says Content Analysis Rating Tool up at the top. If you haven't seen this before, this is our news literacy platform for educators. And this is a system that our analysts also use to rate individual news articles. All the news articles that we rate at Advantage Media are rated through a methodology considering multiple factors for each individual article. We give each article a rating, and then all the article scores are used to provide to create a weighted average for the overall source. Okay, so these articles, I dropped a bunch of them in here for me to analyze. So we're gonna get to go through a bunch of them. We're gonna go through the top 6. Okay, so we have a few headlines. The first headline says, MSNBC's Joy Reid excuses Minnesota rioters, attacks armed lockdown protesters in Michigan. The second headline says, George Floyd protests, police erupt in violence nationwide during the third night of protests. Okay, so these first 6 or so, 6 or 7, 8, actually there's quite a few of them that have to do with the framing, the riots themselves, okay? Before we open up the first article, let's talk about definitions and how these the various words that are used to describe protests and riots are used in these articles. So let's define a few that we're likely to run across. Okay, so there's protest, which is kind of this catch-all term for like everything that's going on. And riot is kind of a catch-all for like a protest plus some violence, okay? So protests and riots are like the kind of the broadest terms that you could use for it, but then there's also these individual terms like looting. And looting is like its own specific activity of like, going into a store and stealing stuff. Vandalism, breaking, that's a specific definition, which is, breaking stuff. Violence, actual, shooting, stabbing, punching, altercations in between, police and protesters, or between, protesters themselves. Then there's like marching, which is, marching is just marching. And there's civil disobedience, okay? Civil disobedience isn't discussed very much in these articles, but just keep in mind how those terms, like depending on which term you use, can really frame the discussion. So if you're lumping them all in together, it tends to blur the situation and make it more binary. So if you're like, if you're talking about protesting and rioting and looting like all in the same breath and not differentiating it from like, protesting in terms of like peaceful marching, then you tend to muddy the waters. All right, let me pull up this first one. Okay, so I'm gonna click on rate this article. And as you see, oh, hold on, let me just change something real quick. Need to change something. Okay. I'm gonna rate this article. Okay. So this is from Red State. This is a pretty right-leaning website if you haven't seen it before. This article comes up here and it says, MSNBC's Joy Reid excuses Minnesota rioters. So the term, look at the term rioters. That's a catch-all, like to include violent actions. Attacks armed lockdown protesters in Michigan, which is interesting. So you got a couple things going on just in this headline. So the focus is on attacking MSNBC and Joy Reid, who's African American. So right-wing media attacking left-wing media, that's kind of a common like us versus them framing in the first instance. But we call the people who are in Minnesota rioters, and we call the people who protested in Michigan protesters, armed lockdown protesters. Okay, so just subtle choice of words there, but it does frame how there's already like a more permissive framing for the armed lockdown protesters in Michigan. Okay, and it starts out with, what is it with MSNBC? All right, so this is a pretty opinionated site. It starts out with a question that kind of begs an opinionated answer. The next line says, they are really out of their minds with their reporting on what's happening in Minneapolis. So just, 2 lines of attack right in a row. And then they object to the framing. They appear to be refusing to call riots riots, because apparently calling what's actually happening by its proper name is bad, as we reported here and here. Interesting, okay? Interesting that they're saying that the proper term for this is riots, as if there's no other term that we could be using. And as we just discussed, there are many other terms we could be using. We could be differentiating between, hold on, let's see. You guys can see my, you guys can see my red state tab, right? I just want to make sure. Give me a thumbs up if you can see. Okay, cool. All right, so let's keep reading along. It says, then MSNBC's Chris Hayes tried to compare rioters to the American Revolution, seemingly trying to justify their action. That's an interesting thing that you do see in left-wing circles. So one of the popular left-leaning talking points was when people on the right would say, destroying property is bad. Then people on the left would say, well, that's what the Boston Tea Party was. The Boston Tea Party was all about destroying property. So why was it okay when our founding fathers did, and it's not okay now, right? So I'm not saying that that's a valid analogy. Like whenever we're looking at analogies, when people try to compare one thing to another, really important exercise is to try to ask how the situations are different, not how they're the same, okay? Okay, so they obviously they don't think that this comparing rioters to the American Revolution is a valid meme, is a valid talking point. So that's interesting to note. If you're on the left, you're likely to think that that's a totally good analogy, like, oh yeah, that was property destruction. Good point. Maybe violence is, destroying property is fine as a form of protest. Okay, but clearly the folks on the right think that that's not a valid comparison, and there's a whole article about why. So you should go and read that article and understand why your meme about the Boston Tea Party is not persuasive to your right-wing friends. Okay. Okay, let's keep going. So that wasn't all. So she takes, this author takes exception with MSNBC's Joy Reid compared the situation in Minneapolis to that of the armed protesters against the lockdown in Michigan, as though to suggest that the different reaction of the police was racism. So their position here is that this was definitely not racism, okay? These different reactions of the police, okay? So the author talks about white men who can get armed up and walk into state capitol, that's okay, and the police are benign, they don't even act afraid. But let black people show up and protest the death of an innocent black man, and suddenly we got to go full force. So you're getting to see a little bit of the argument here is surfaced, this argument by Joy Reid. And then again, you see what the right-leaning author says as a counterpoint. Well, what was the difference? Okay, here they're taking time to parse, the difference in the comparison, the analogy that Joy Reid is making. It says the armed Michigan protesters weren't breaking the law, and they even had their temperature checked before they went into the state house and complied with every requirement of the police. Some of the white mean this is a typo, white men. Sometimes typos are indicative of bad quality, but otherwise typos are just typos. And some of the white men were also people of color and women, but that doesn't fit the narrative Reid is trying to paint. Uneven treatment comes from different actions. So, there's a lot of justification for defending armed protesters who were mostly white in Michigan versus the violent protesters here. So it's a real clear us versus them, like Joy Reid is wrong for all these reasons. They should be called riots. Riots are bad. At the summary here at the end says, painting rioters just as protesters, as Joy Reid did, is excusing rioters and giving a false picture of the facts. But hey, it's MSDNC, okay? So MSDNC is like a favorite, attack point for on the right is saying that like MSNBC is a wing of the Democratic National Party. So so these kinds of sentences should be indicative to you of bias, okay, of right-leaning bias. So when that's a pretty short article. I want to talk about how we actually would rate this at Advantage Media. We look at a number of different things because I know a lot of you will read that article and say, okay, it doesn't strike, like your gut intuition probably will tell you that this is an opinion piece and it's a right-leaning. So, fairly significantly right-leaning, okay? We look at individual factors like expression. So expression means, is it expressed as fact, analysis, or opinion? And this one, I think you'd agree with the sentences we read. A lot of these are opinion. Between 4 and 5 is analysis opinion / opinion. So I'd rate it here in this opinion section. The headline and graphic. The headline and graphic does match the content of the article, so we'll leave that here as a 2. Veracity, so veracity on a scale of 1 to 5 means things that are definitely true, things that are definitely false, things that are here in the middle are things that are neither true nor false. In this case, since most of the statements were opinion statements, there wasn't anything that was like necessarily factually incorrect. Maybe some of the framing of the characterization of Joy Reid's statements were incorrect. So we're going to leave that here as a likely like a 3 for neither. A lot of these statements are neither provable nor disprovable. Okay, so for an overall reliability score, you have our analysts have discretion on how to rate this. I'd rate this as like an opinion analysis article right in this area. It doesn't have to be a straight average. For rating how left and right it is, we look at a number of things. Comparison, meaning comparison to other news articles about the same subject. So we haven't looked at other news articles yet, so we don't have a good frame of reference for this. But in terms of based on my reading of other news articles and my familiarity with it, I would say this is among the like pretty solidly right set of articles. The language is pretty hyper-partisan, right? Things like MSDNC, that's pretty squarely over here too. And then political position, being just generally anti-protests and riots. That's pretty right-wing position over here too. So this score, I'd put it in this area. So about a 30 and 23. So that's how we'd rate an article like this in on the media bias chart. Let's look at something on the left. Okay, let's look at an article from Slate. Okay, Slate. Okay, it says police erupt in violence nationwide. Okay, and the picture is of police in riot gear using tear gas in Seattle. So they get like full-on masks and shields and tear gas guns and full body armor. Okay, so let's take a read, shall we? The ongoing protests following the killing of George Floyd were caught up in violence again on Saturday as police all over the country tear gas protesters, drove vehicles through crowds, opened fire with non-lethal rounds on journalists or people walking on their own property, and in at least one instance pushed over an elderly man who was walking away with a cane. Here's some of the ways law enforcement escalated the national unrest. Okay, so here the focus is on none of these are untrue. These are all things that happened, right? And a lot of times the focus of the article, the topic focus, is the thing that gives it its left lean or right lean. Okay, so here it's certainly there were, like, as we know, there were other incidents of like looters and vandalizers, breaking windows and setting fire to things and stuff like that, right? This article doesn't focus on that, okay? This article focuses on the things that the police did to escalate violence, which are, left-leaning talking points, excessive, just being against excessive police force is generally of interest to left-leaning audiences. Militarization of the police is a concern for folks on the left. Attacks on the media, attacks on journalists tend to be something that the left focuses on as well, especially since calling journalists and members of the media just like fake news and attacking them is kind of a right-wing talking point at the moment. Okay, so there's lots of Twitter feeds and surfacing of actual things the police did on Twitter. Okay, so it's just kind of a list of videos and facts. Okay, so this is fairly like it's factual and and presents things that actually did happen, and not super opinionated language here. It's pretty straightforward, a little bit of analysis here, but the focus is strictly on things. It's like a pretty it's a pretty narrow focus on one topic. Now, I'm not saying every single article has to focus on every single part of the story. Certainly, that's not possible in every article. But this is designed to shine a spotlight on a particular issue of interest to left-leaning audiences. Okay. Now you can decide that Joy Reid's like the failure to call riots is a legitimate complaint, and you can also determine that the actions of police are a legitimate a thing to legitimately raise concern about, right? You can agree with either of those things. Use those facts to inform what's most important to you. But if you're just reading like one side of these kinds of articles, you're missing a fuller picture. You still don't have all the information about, like, you don't have a holistic information about protests and riots and what's happening generally. So how we'd rate this, so expression, as we said, the most of the stuff in there was pretty factual, like the statements were stated as fact, not very opinionated. There's a little bit of a analysis in there, so we'll leave that as like a 2 for fact analysis. The headline and graphic, the police engage in violence. So that's that's a pretty solidly analysis kind of characterization of what happened. So we'll leave that kind of here in the middle. Veracity, there's certainly nothing untrue about that. And we're going to account for bias on the bias scale. So I would leave this in this mix of, I'd call this a mix of fact reporting and analysis, and leave it in this area right here. For bias, the comparison, certainly if you compare it to the article before, this is pretty solidly left on the focus on police violence. The language is not very extreme. There's nothing that necessarily indicates that there's that they're using linguistic rhetoric to, other than the police engage in violence, which is fairly accurate. So we call that lean left a little bit. And then for a political position, you can imagine if there's a left and right position on the police use of force in the situation, it would be quite related to the fact that there were people who were engaging in violent behavior in some cases, right? So maybe in some of these cases it was justified, and they're not showing that, right? Who knows? But let's call this lean left on position. So for overall bias, we'd probably have that as skews left, okay? That's how we'd rate something like this. That's how we'd talk through these kind of issues. So, when you look at topics like this and you analyze them and like rate them factor by factor, it allows you to step back and take a little bit a more detached view of the difficult topics that you're talking about. Like police violence is really hard to talk about, like destruction of property, and certainly the killing of a man at the hands of police is even tougher to talk about. okay? So we're gonna look at some like slightly tougher articles right now, but I just want you to understand that the process of looking at the words, the political positioning, the headlines and graphics, like the things that are true and untrue in the article, allows you to somewhat remove the emotion that you might initially feel by just like taking in the article all at once. Okay. Now, understand when if you're teaching this in the class, you know, I wouldn't start with this topic. Okay. I'd start with something that's you know, if you're going to be using CART in a classroom to teach news literacy, there are topics that are a little bit less, you know, that affect people a little bit less personally, or a lot less personally, like stuff about taxes or like foreign policy or things like that. Okay. This topic will affect some of your students a great deal, okay? And I know this topic will affect you personally a great deal. So some of this stuff can be really maddening, okay? And it's really hard when you're looking at, like, as a student or as just a news consumer looking at something for the first time. Like if you've experienced you know, the effects of systemic racism and overt racism in your life, your whole life, you know, reading about these events is not going to be as simple as just like taking a detached view, looking at the words, looking at the language, and then it's like making a rating. Okay. It can anger you. It can upset you. This is the same. The same thing is going to happen when you're like if you're talking about immigration and some of your students are immigrants themselves, and they're you know, some of the language is characterizing people as you know, illegal invaders or something like that, right? If it affects you personally, you're going to be angry about it, and you know, I want you to be able um, to use this exercise of evaluating articles so you can talk about those really hard issues, because you know, if you have a diverse class with people of, you know, if you have black and white students, and you know, some of them are accustomed to reading articles from the right side of the spectrum, and some of them are accustomed to reading articles from the left side of the spectrum, they're going to you bring in very different perspectives as to like why a phrase, some terminology, the image, why that might be upsetting to them, or why they might not find it upsetting at all. And you can have those discussions. But so if you start with like a less, you know, a less personal topic, then and get students in the practice of seeing like, all right, this is how stuff is presented across the spectrum. Then you can dive into these more difficult topics, and you know, and dive into it from a you know, a rhetorical analysis type of viewpoint that allows people to have those natural discussions that come up, and you know, evokes the difficult discussions about, you know, police violence and systemic racism in this particular context that are really important to have. Okay. I know it can be a little bit scary for educators to dive in, because no educator wants to be accused of bias. But if you present it like, you know, you are reading and you are evaluating and you are coming to decisions yourself, and you're facilitating those discussions, and you're having a student speak to their own experiences when they read these articles, yeah, that's the best way to do it. And you know, we've got to. I don't want you to be afraid of diving into these really, really hard subjects. Let's look at a couple of really, you know, kind of out there ones. Well, one's kind of out there. The other one I don't think is. Well, let's. All right. Here's an article from The Root. So The Root is primarily is a publication with, I think, almost all Black authors and journalists. Certainly, mostly Black authors and journalists, if not all. So you know, the perspective and the framing of riots in this situation, or protests, looting, burning, etc., focuses on something different entirely. It's a context and like reasons and justification for it. Okay, now that might strike some folks on the right as like, you know, unacceptable or outrageous or egregious. That like, how can any you know, violence, looting, you know, destruction of property be justifiable? But you know, if you know, listening to someone who is Black write about it, and from the perspective of a Black person, you can see why these arguments exist. Okay, so it says, without the proper context, it is impossible to understand the mushroom cloud of uprisings that are exploding across the country in the wake of deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and countless others. Okay, so just right off the bat, it's a mushroom cloud of uprisings that are exploding across the country, right? So it's not saying looting or, you know, or you know, vandalism or setting fires or anything like that. It's a mushroom cloud of uprisings, okay? And then the naming of the like most recent victims, that's kind of missing in a lot of other coverage. Like, so George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and countless others. So a lot of current articles will mention George Floyd, but no one else that was recently killed at the hands of excessive police violence. And then it says, to contextualize anger, frustration, and desperation that forced protesters to recreate the lawlessness and chaos that Black people experience on a daily basis, the Root has created a timeline of some of the events that led up to Black people across the country collectively saying, "All right, then," is the quote. Okay, so this is the language used is not so much about like the looting and vandalism, but to frame anger, frustration, desperation as like you know, justifications and reason, right? So folks on the right who, if you think back to the Red State article saying, oh, you know, Joy Reid is like excusing and justifying rioters. Well, that does exist. Like there is justification of such violence in certain articles like this one. And so, and the context that's being provided is accurate. It is indeed a list of things that have happened in the United States from the first, you know, ship of slaves to come to you know, what would eventually become the United States, to, you know, laws that allowed the murder of slaves without any criminal liability, to you know, the creation of police forces, the first police brutality protests, the like Supreme Court cases like Dred Scott v. Sanford, the Civil War, the founding of the Ku Klux Klan, you know, the civil rights movement in the 60s. So that, like, there's a lot. There's a long list of stuff. So the focus here clearly is not on like, you know, looting and violence and destruction of property and fires, right? The focus is on like, given this long history, you know, what is how bad are these, right? Now, again, up to you to make the determination on that. So you take in all this information about like perspective of like, you know, what has happened, what has been done to Black people in this country over many years, and then look at what's happening today, and you can contextualize that for yourself. Like, you use all these things to make sense. But you'll see other you know, going back to something, we won't go through and rate this one. Let me just go back to another article. But you'll, you look at another article about, that just talks about stuff that's happening today. It says, this one from Town Hall, a right-leaning, very right-leaning news source says, burning cities and blaming Trump brings no justice for George Floyd. So it talks about how like the destruction of property and violence that followed the death of Floyd have only further driven a wedge between law enforcement and those outraged by a shocking death. So here they're saying like, yes, of course, you know, the killing of George Floyd is bad, but let's not burn things down. That's not going to help. That's only going to divide people, right? There's another article that I wanted to show you. This one is this is an interesting one. oh, Minneapolis mayor, this is from PJ Media, another right-leaning source. It says the Minneapolis mayor says looting unacceptable, then allows sacking of police station for public safety. So yeah, they focus on how the Democratic mayor has overseen the sacking of an entire section of Minneapolis near the police station. Rioters have caused hundreds of millions of dollars of damage by burning, stealing, and vandalizing the name of honoring, in the name of honoring George Floyd. Talks about destroying space and pictures of fires, and he accuses the Democratic mayor of purposely allowing this kind of conduct to take place. So there's all this focus on like you can have lists of a lot of things. You can have a list of all the things that have happened to Black people in the history of the country. You can have lists of all the things that are being burnt down and destroyed in conjunction with these protests. You can have a list of all the acts of police officers that are being violent right now. Okay, so if you take all these things into account, we didn't get a chance to look at like more complete coverage, but the more complete coverage tends to be more nuanced. It will here, let me just show you one real quick here from The Guardian. So Night of Flames and Fury, as Minneapolis swells with outrage over George Floyd killing. Okay, so they do talk about things that are burned, but then they talk about the chants by the marchers. They talk about they get quotes from people who are angry and why. They talk about the reactions from the mayor, and give more like a more complete picture of like what is happening now, right? So when you take together all of these articles, there's a few things that you can take away, and here are those. Here are the main things. One, if there's a certain segment of media on the right and the left that will just take this and focus squarely on like narrow things that will make this like pro-riot and anti-riot. Like you're either for the protest or you're against the protest. And it's really not that simple. But social media incentivizes people to make it that simple. Let me share with you something else. Here's how this, hold on. Here's a meme of that I saw on social media that I just kind of rolled my eyes at, but hold on. Oh, where did it go? I can't find it right now. Sorry, I wish I could show it to you, but I'll have to pass on that. You might have seen this, okay? On the top, it's a picture of Martin Luther King Jr. Arm in arm with other protesters about to, cross the Selma Bridge, okay? The Edmund Pettus Bridge, okay? And it was like an iconic picture, iconic moment, okay? And then on the bottom is a picture of people like burning like Target, and people like throwing bottles at it and like running out with clothes, okay? And on the top it says, this is a protest. And on the bottom it says, this is a crime, okay? So that's how it gets polarized, as if there's only the binary of like, no, there's only nice, peaceful protests, just like Martin Luther King always wanted, and that's the only thing that ever happened back in the civil rights era. Or there's like this, vandalism, destruction, and looting, and that's what all the Democrats are doing right now. And we can't have any of that, and so it's not going to help at all, right? Those are like the two polarizing opposites that these kind of articles encourage. But it's really not. As you read a broader spectrum of articles, you realize that it's not a binary, right? It's not. What people come away with from understanding the nature and reading about the history of racism and police brutality and riots and protests in this country is that it's nuanced, it's complex, it's civil rights leaders like I don't know if you saw, there was a speech by Killer Mike, who's a prominent civil rights activist. There was Barack Obama has said similar things. They talk about they're leading activists, and leading activists tend to say things that are nuanced about the role of like violence and looting and things like that in context of a protest. Okay. So like Martin Luther King is like the example that's held up because he's glorified today for always taking a nonviolent approach himself. Okay, but yes, it was a nonviolent approach. He always advocated for like nonviolence, but he knew that there would be met with violence in response. Okay, so a lot of Martin Luther King Jr.'s protests or training of his activists was to brace themselves for violence that would befall them and not react with violence. Okay, they would, and even though they were engaged in nonviolent protest, it was usually civil disobedience, which means the breaking of some rules and laws. Right, sitting in a segregated diner, right? That was against the law. The protest, like that picture marching across Edmund Pettus Bridge, was actually illegal, right? So the state trooper said, "We will beat you if you cross this bridge," and they crossed the bridge anyways, and they got beat, right? So it's not like his methods were like all just peaceful. Sorry, all just not like according to the rules. There was a lot of rule breaking involved. Peaceful rule breaking, but rule breaking nonetheless. And that kind of civil disobedience is exactly what got momentum, public momentum, and pressure around the Civil Rights Act. During that time, though, as you can imagine, there were folks who did not agree with his approach of nonviolence, just like people today don't agree with the approach of nonviolence. They say, no, you got to break stuff, otherwise I won't listen to you, right? Like Louis Farrakhan and Malcolm X and other people in civil rights movement took less of a let's have nonviolence at all times. But even like Martin Luther King Jr. Took a nuanced approach, as activists right now are taking a nuanced approach. They say, Martin Luther King's famous quote is, "The right is the language of the unheard," right? So even though he promoted nonviolence, he said, you got to understand that some people, not all these people have been trained in my ways of nonviolence, or are unable for some reason to act in the way that you always would like them to act. We prefer that people not be violent because, yes, it induces backlash. It distracts from the message. It makes people focus on just the rioting and looting as they're doing today. Like people who want the status quo to stay the same will tend to focus on rioting and looting and saying, that vandalism is bad. You're not helping your own cause. You should stop that, instead of focusing on the actual issues of like, needing systemic, police reform, right? So the whole idea behind reading all these different articles is to see what people prioritize as important, what people say is important across the left, right, and center. Okay, across diversity of race and diversity of political opinions, and based on that whole survey, you can decide what is actually important. Okay, once you have like everything, it's not like both sides necessarily have equal facts on the side. If one side is focusing on like rioting and looting as the worst thing ever, and that's all we're going to write about, and the other side is talking about protesting against police reform to reduce violence against Black people, in my judgment, it's more important to have reform of police brutality, right? And you can come to your own judgment, right? But given the facts, that's where I would personally land. Okay. you can make a call. I know we've gone over time. I want to leave you with, I'll stay on for questions, but I want to leave you with some action items to do. The main thing I implore you to do is to do something from where you are, help from where you are, and whatever that looks like for you, whether it's teaching news literacy in your classrooms, helping people understand that their news is biased, whether it's protesting yourself or marching yourself or voting or supporting candidates. What I want you to do is some form of civic exercise. Having a good media diet and understanding your own media consumption is just half of it. In order to make yourself feel good and not feel like you have a sense of hopelessness or despair about not being able to do anything or fix anything, the antidote to that is going out and doing civic exercise. So vote, donate, educate others, talk to people in your community, speak out on social media, whatever it looks like for you. Okay. All right. That's all I got today. If you've got some questions, I'll stick around for them. Otherwise, have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vanessa.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Thanks, guys. I will stick around to chat with you all if you want. So.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Vanessa?
Yes.
So can you just give me a little bit of information about how, I know you have a lot of articles, but if we're trying to get some articles to take into the classroom, how do you start on that?
Yeah, so we actually provide articles every week about different topics.
So are the articles you provide every week current?
Yes.
Okay.
And you can also add your own. So what we do is, as you saw, we just went through a handful, but we didn't read all of them. This is an exercise that takes some time, and we put in 6 articles per week, and they're usually about different topics from across the news spectrum. So they can be about taxes or immigration or a thing Trump said or did, or LGBT civil rights, a Supreme Court case. So every week we pick some that are a few left, a few right, a couple that are in the center. The balance kind of shifts a little bit week to week, but we put those in every week, and you can select which ones you want to do. So it's time consuming to go and do that yourself, but if you wanted, you can. If you just wanted to cover climate change or an oil and gas issue or something like that, you could select your articles and put them in there for your students to rate. But we put them out, we put them in there just because we think that the best way to not only keep informed with current events, but to understand how media bias affects how we think. It's important for students to regularly see articles from across the spectrum.
Okay, so you join in a certain way for that, or does one school join? How do you?
Yeah, on our website, there's a section under for educators. It says CART News Literacy Platform, and we have it's a monthly subscription. We have a free trial, 30 days for a single classroom up to 150 students, I believe, and it starts at $40 a month. And there's semester subscriptions, but if you use it for a whole school, or sorry, a whole department or a whole school, we have different tiers of pricing for that.
I wouldn't know where to put myself because I'm doing this with the League of Women Voters, and it's a program that we have on voting, and part of that program is how do you know who to vote for, and so it's how to know how to read news type thing. It's just what you're doing, but I'm not sure where I would put myself as an organization, because like in the fall, we'll probably develop something that we can send to the teachers to use, but it'll be teachers in all different schools.
Yeah, it kind of depends on, we can talk offline if you want, like one-on-one about how to structure that. But yeah, it just kind of depends on how many students or analysts would be using it. So analysts can be, we talk about it in the, like a school setting, 7 to 12, or, a college or post-grad, but it's certainly for adult education as well.
Okay. Well, how do I get in touch with you to talk offline?
Go ahead and email us at info@adfontesmedia.com. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. I saw a question about how do you find like the words to compare, like riots, protests, peaceful sit-ins. Each nuanced topic must have quite a number of so-called keywords to look for. Yes. So, and then another. Dan said, when you read enough, they kind of jump off the page. And yeah, as Andrew said, no quick lists to start. So we don't, we tend to not like compile like dictionaries, but just because they tend to shift quite a bit over time. There are certain ones that kind of persist over many years, like, pro-choice versus pro-life, or estate tax versus death tax, or like undocumented immigrants versus illegal aliens, things like that. But each topic, like for protests and riots right now, it's best to kind of see how certain media characterize them in the moment, because like in this particular news cycle, the words that right-wing media tend to be very similar across all right-wing media, and the words that left-wing media tend to be all very similar. So yeah, Dan is right. They kind of do jump off the page, but what I advise is, if you're teaching these topics and you are assigning articles to your students, it's one topic per week. So it's kind of manageable for you to like get your head around the topic before you assign it to your students. So you get your head around like a LGBT civil rights case at the Supreme Court would be a topic for a week. And you'll see that there are terms in there like religious liberty or right to discriminate, like those kind of terms your students might not necessarily recognize as loaded political terms, but you do, just because you have more political knowledge. So I would make sure to like educate your students on those when they come across that. Like if you're reading an article together and you say, somebody says, this case is about the religious liberty for business owners, and you have your students talk about that sentence, if they don't recognize that religious liberty is something that's used more on the right than on the left, you can point that out to them.
Vanessa, I had a quick question.
Yeah.
As we're trying to improve our media diet, especially at a time like this, and to stay informed, do you find it's better to focus in on consuming content from only like Associated Press and something that's very in the middle, right at the top, or should you include more of like an opinion pieces from the right, opinion pieces from the left? And if it's the latter, do you have any publications on both sides that you find are well-informed, well-educated, well-written? And that also would help us to figure out and understand those buzzwords when we see them.
Yeah, no, I think if you're if you're trying to be like a savvy news consumer, the stuff in the green box in the media bias chart is all good stuff. So it's kind of a shame that we have to like stack rank them against each other, because it's not that The Economist is worse than AP. It's just that they're different kinds of good. Okay, so like people say, oh, that's terrible, like why do you have The Economist rank low? Economist is like one of my favorite publications, just because it's like they're is a lot of there's a lot of facts in journalism in it, but there's a lot of analysis, okay, and there's a lot of context in it, right? So we have to have an axis for reliability. So we had to make a choice of what to put at the top, and what we put at the top is the work that journalists do, like the actual getting of the facts. And so like when the getting and the reporting of like just the facts, we rate higher than the facts plus some really good analysis and content, because and the good analysis and content has a lot in common with like the bad analysis and content, so just along a spectrum. So I recommend like getting everything kind of in the green box. Okay. The only purpose of like regularly reading stuff that's like in the like yellow and orange boxes is to understand your political opponents and what they're reading. Okay, I wouldn't rely on those to be informed at all. I mean, and this goes for the cable channels, and I know it's tempting because like I always say that like the cable channels are like the donuts and fries of the news. They are, right? It's convenient too because it's on TV and you don't have to read it and you can just like turn it on at night. But if you just listen to an hour of MSNBC or CNN or Fox News, you're only going to get, like right now, you're only going to get stories about protests and coronavirus. Like that's it. You're not going to get anything else. So you're not going to know what else is going on in the world, right? So if you want to be like really broadly informed, all the stuff in the green box is super important. But yeah, I'm not a big fan of like the opinion sections, like that are just straight opinion sections, even in some of our more reputable publications in this country, like New York Times and Washington Post. I kind of wish that our biggest journalism organizations would get out of the opinion business, because I think it confuses people and it impugns bias to a otherwise very reputable news source. I don't know if you saw it, but like the New York Times got a bunch of flack for publishing a op-ed from Tom Cotton, which was just like a straight right-wing opinion piece, because he's a right-wing politician, right? Same if you publish like we publish the views of a liberal Democratic senator or congressman, right? People always point to those publications being super biased because of those opinion sources. But anyways, to answer your question, stick to the green box for you to be informed. Read the other stuff to know what other people are reading.
Awesome, thank you.
Cool. All right. Any other questions?
Vanessa?
Yes.
Would you mind demonstrating and telling us a little bit more about the cart tool?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what in particular?
Well, you were drawing some sliders up and down,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't quite understand what the numbers in the little slider changed.
Mm-hmm.
And I just, for someone who wants to start doing some analysis and
Mm-hmm.
might want to use the cart site, I'd like to understand a little bit more about it.
Yeah, so it would be best if we could do like a one-on-one demo, just because there's like a lot to it, and if not everybody is like interested in cart, I don't want to like have them go through it. But a couple things, I will be doing a series of webinars, like a 6-webinar series in the second half of June and all throughout July, specifically for teachers who want to get trained on how to use cart in their classrooms. So you don't have to, it's free, you don't have to buy cart, and you can still use the principles for analyzing articles even if you end up like not buying it for budgetary reasons or whatever. But we'll talk about like exactly how to rate articles according to our methodology, and we'll go through different topics every week. So we'll go through we'll touch on at least like 6 different political topics, since we're going to go over the course of 6 weeks, and we'll make a continuing education units available for that. We'll have like a certificate of completion, things of that sort. But if you want it, we do demos, so if you can request one on our website, or you can just email us at info@adfontevmedia, and I'd be happy to go through that with you. Cool. All right. Anyone else? You guys just want to hang out and talk? If you guys want to talk about other stuff like the actual like substance of these articles and the politics of it, we're happy to.
Vanessa?
Yeah.
So I made a comment in the chat box, but I'm curious. Everything old seems new again, and I think I'm older than you are. There was a show in the '70s called Room 222, and it was basically it was an interracial group in Los Angeles that was in high school together, and there was this enlightened teacher, Pete Dixon, who did pretty well what you're describing. He basically brought out all the issues from multiple sides, and the key thing is that he refused to summarize. Everybody had to draw their own conclusion based on the information. It's basically your judgment in the classroom. So I was just wondering if you ever saw that series, and if not, maybe.
No, I'll check it out.
Yeah,
Room 222.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a few particular episodes. One or two comes to mind. If they're not all like that, because I didn't watch the whole series, let me know, and I'll point you to one or two.
Interesting.
Yeah, and the principal came in and wanted Pete Dixon, after hearing all this stuff, to basically do the summarizing in the whole jingoistic thing that, but America was doing it right. And Pete goes, I'm not going to do that. Every student gets to make their own conclusion. So that was, that was enlightening for me as a young person at that time.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's I think it's kind of key to this approach. You know, people don't like the idea of being told what to think, even though they're always being told what to think constantly. I mean, the news sources are always telling you what to think, right? But people are like, no, don't tell me what to think, teacher. I would like somebody else to tell me what to think, like my left-wing or right-wing news sources, right?
That's my point. I think a lot of people do want to be told what to think, and once they're told what to think, anybody else or any other viewpoint, no matter how armed with facts that might be, that challenges that viewpoint, to your point, because of echo chambers and stuff like that, people actually, in my experience, do enjoy being told what to think.
Yeah, people like to be influenced. People are influenced all the time. They just don't like if they perceive that they're being told what to think, then they don't like it. So, like when introducing the media bias chart, I actually usually start by introducing a blank media bias chart and saying like, this is what it is. Like, here's a lay of the media landscape. Here's our process for how we came up with this, and here's and then I show them the sources, because I don't know if you've experienced this. You probably have. If you've ever shared the media bias chart on your website, people will immediately go to the source that they like the best, and they say, I disagree, that it shouldn't be there, this is biased.
I get it all the time. I mean, even Reuters, which is like just news, is regarded. Yeah, you're rolling your eyes too, because you get this all the time too. Exactly.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So just so you guys know, like we're trying to capture more articles that people find to be really biased or like outside the bounds of like acceptable content for a particular source. So we have like a report or rate this article feature on our website now. So if you go to like our news, the menu item that says news ratings, you can actually submit articles and like tell us about them if you want them to be rated. We can't get to all of them, but the number one criticism or like number one like feedback that we get online is people say, oh, well, I guess you need to move ABC News down because did you see this article? And no, like the whole rating of all of NBC's body of or ABC's body of work is not going to be like tanked because there was one article that this one guy thought was biased. But those articles that are particularly biased, like that New York Times piece op-ed with Tom Cotton, made everybody in like the like left-wing Twitter think like New York Times is terrible today, right? So because those kind of articles have a big impact on people's perception, so we do want to hear about those. Yeah, so please do tell us about those kind of articles. Also, if you get feedback from people who want to who think that our news our media bias chart is biased, and they like give you some examples and they seem earnest and they seem like they really care about the news, invite them to be to apply to be an analyst. We're actually going to be putting out a call here, and we'll have a form on our website recruiting a new like cohort to like go through a 10-week analyst rating period. It's going to be like it's going to be like a training period, but with some we're actually going to do analysis, and we'll provide some perks and benefits and stuff. So it won't be, it will like provide a small stipend and things like that, but we will be taking new analyst applications here pretty soon. Okay.
Remind us. So, what's the time requirement for that?
Like 5 to 6 hours a week.
Oh, really? Okay. So
Yeah.
not onerous. Okay.
Not too bad. Yeah. And that'll be it's kind of like a training course, but we will use the ratings provided that they are meet quality control, and that'll allow folks who want to in the future be paid analysts on our team to qualify for that.
How connected are you to? I don't expect you to be connected with the New York Times, but how connected are you with some of the medium-sized news sources, the ones that have only sprung up in the past year or two? Are you connected at all?
I mean, what do you mean by connected? Like,
okay,
there's some.
It would be, and I sort of contributed this in the chat too. It would be interesting if some news sources would be willing to, and you'd have to start with the ones that are close to central on the horseshoe. That would be willing to create some sort of a stamp that basically says this is the ad fontes rating for this overall source of that sort of a thing, and show where they are on the horseshoe, and so people who would read it would basically see that rating. It would be a wonderful thing to get to if many news sources would do that.
Yeah, so there have been some that have expressed interest in like wanting to like use, if they're rated well, there are some news sources that like want to display that. So we've received some interest about that. Just so you know, our policy on that is like if anyone asks us to rate them, we will not charge any news sources to rate them. But if any choose to use our ratings, like a Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval or like a JD Power Award, then we would charge a licensing fee for that.
Okay.
Just we can't have people pay us to rate them, because that would be a conflict of interest.
No, fair enough. Sorry, I'm thinking of a Brit thing. There's a certain society of British pubs that have real ale. Hand pulled, all the good stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And you actually pay, if you're a pub, you actually pay to get this sticker that you're actually rated as a real ale pub. And then if I've got my app, I basically go and I find pubs that are like that.
Yeah. Yep. So when we're big enough, then publishers will care.
I wonder if anybody wanted to talk about perceived bias of the major newspapers, because I think it's a really interesting subject. I'm thinking the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Times. These are the three great newspapers of the country, I think. And I read others, but I subscribe digitally to all three of them, and they, you just get inundated with stuff. You just sip at those papers, and yet there's so much great writing. And one of the problems, I'm in debate groups with cross-partisan debate groups, and they insist that there's a difference between the Washington Post and, as I say, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Well, there certainly is a difference in the editorial board policy. And there certainly is a weight in the opinion pieces on the two sides. But when you look at Wall Street Journal factual reporting and Washington Times factual reporting, they're almost the same. They're sorry, I'm getting a phone call from my wife who's out of town. I gotta. So anyway, it'll go away. So does anybody want to talk about that?
Yeah, we'll talk about that, Dan. Answer your wife's phone call.
Yeah, no, she'll call me back. So it's a difference between the factual reporting and the institutional bias of the Times, the WAPO, and the Journal. They do bleed. There's a little bleeding, but facts should be facts. Now, when you listen to Maggie Haberman, she's one of the great reporters, I think, of all time. She's not without bias, but she is so disciplined in how she expresses herself, that even when she lets a little bias show, you kind of suspect that she's suspicious of her own bias. And that's what makes a great reporter. They are conscious of their bias. Now, are opinion writers, are they really journalists? Is David Brooks really a journalist? He's one of my favorite writers, but is he really a journalist? He's not. He's not trying to report the news. He's trying to contextualize the news.
Yeah.
And so when you talk about false news and unfair news, it's difficult to separate the two, and I think it's mainly because of the cable news networks. The reason I became an analyst in this project is because of an article that Vanessa wrote on CNN. I really liked CNN, but I was really uncomfortable at the same time. And I couldn't really put my finger on why I didn't like it, or why I was uncomfortable. I was still watching it, but I knew there was something wrong. So the cable networks do not properly segregate factual reporting from opinion. And that's a big problem.
Yeah, no, I think that's one of the main problems in the fact that things aren't labeled as fact, opinion, analysis. They're not labeled in any consistent way across the board, across the different news sites, and I think that itself leads to a lot of confusion. It leads people to consume a lot of content that's analysis and opinion and think that it's news. So when the more you blur the lines between the two, the more like the more it invites lack of trust. The reason I said I think that the major newspapers should get out of the opinion business is because everyone is in the opinion business, and opinions are cheap. You know that phrase, opinions are like, you know what, everyone has one and they all stink, right? It's because like it's super cheap to have a website and say, this is my opinion about it, right? And the ones that are at the New York Times and Washington Post, they just like, they have like big followings and they're prolific writers and they get these good gigs and they're very influential as writers because they happen to have like a regular column in the New York Times and Washington Post. But it's no more opinion than somebody else's opinion on some site that they started, 6 months ago or a year ago, right? Or influential YouTube star. And so since there are so many people in the opinion business, I don't think that newspapers need to be in that anymore. And I think it would improve their trust levels because they could focus on the thing that they're uniquely qualified to do, which is report the news. They could, because not every like a little website on the internet has a team of journalists and editors, right? The journalists are uniquely qualified to go and do journalism. And to the extent that they also publish opinion stuff in their papers, it detracts from their credibility as journalists. Look, everybody says like, we've all got a responsibility to use our platform and speak, but you know what? I think that there are certain people and institutions like whose job it is to just deliver the news, and they should do that as much as they can because they're uniquely qualified to do that. Like that's why local news anchors, nightly broadcast news anchors like ABC, CBS, and NBC, and like straight news reporters and the AP and Reuters, like people who report just facts in that format have respect because they just don't delve into analysis and opinion. The second they step out from reporting into the facts, they just inherently lose trust. So Dan Rather, Brian Williams, they went from being nightly news anchors to now being, analysts. They provide a lot of analysis in their news coverage. Now they're seen as partisan, right? And therefore they've just lost trust. It's a matter of the format. So anyways, I'm I got a question. Is there a way to encourage major news media to identify bias and opinion in their contributions? Don't mind the papers providing opinion pieces when they're quality. Yeah, there would be a way to do it, like rating them on media bias chart. I mean, there's no news rating the standard out there, right? We're doing this for the first time. Movies are rated PG, PG-13, R, things like that. They have content ratings on them. There are no content ratings for news sources, and that's the void that we're trying to fill. We didn't used to need that, like when there was only like 3 network news stations and like your local papers, and that was it. We didn't need news ratings, but now we do need news ratings. So that's the void that we're trying to fill. It's 7:30 my time. I'm getting hungry. So I'll bid you adieu, and I really enjoy your attention and conversation and participation. You guys are the best. So good night.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Vanessa.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vanessa. It was great.
Yeah, thanks. This was excellent. Great night. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Guys and gals.